Welcome to our 9th episode of Day-to-Day Devops, a Bright Talk original series where every month we explore how businesses can realise the transformative power of technology in the cloud, but securely, responsibly and ethically. I am Helen Beal, and today we are talking about data ops. I'm joined by Chris, Garima and Matthew. Before we get started, I want to remind the audience we are live today and therefore taking your questions, so please let us have them and we'll answer them live too. So let's get started. Let's get started with Garima. So Garima, what made you start thinking about data ops?
Thank you, Helen, and thanks for this opportunity today. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. I'm based in Ottawa, Canada. I'm the founder for the community of practice of DevOps in Canada. It has 3 chapters, Toronto, Ottawa, and Edmonton. I'm also the co-organizer for the DevOps Summit in Canada, which happens in November. And it leads me to actually your question, what got me interested into data ops. So I have been dedicatedly working around DevOps since 6 years. And I understood that data is an integral part of DevOps. And when I was actually investigating the challenges and opportunities around data, I found out they have a similarity in how the opportunities are building up. And I would say that data is as similar as DevOps. It's a team sport. And the challenge which we have today with data is how to make it agile, how to build governance around data. So that is what got me interested. And I would talk about my point of view during this conversation. So hopefully you will get some insights out of what we have learned from the past in the journey of DevOps and how do we take it forward with data ops.
We're certainly looking forward to hearing about that. Matthew, what got you starting thinking about data ops?
So I think it was when we began sort of 30 years ago. I worked for a software company called Objectivity, and we learned a lot and we made a lot of mistakes. And I wanted to make sure this time that we didn't face the same challenges, or at least that we addressed them better. So I think, as Garima said, nobody is better than everybody. So I think the key thing is to get people working together, promote transparency, promote collaboration, get everyone seeing the same goals and heading in the right direction. So you don't have to be on a tightrope, but sort of on a broad beam, a torch shining forward, get everyone aligned, get your data strategy aligned with your business strategy. And that means everyone sets off in the right direction at the beginning. And it puts a focus back on business value, because when we start learning new technologies, we quite often focus on the technology itself. And really, it's all about delivering value to a business. So I think that was really what got us thinking about it and what's kept us up ever since.
So definitely hearing already some themes around culture and team sport. But Chris, what about you? What got you starting thinking about data ops?
Well, I'm a software engineer by training. And then in about 2005, I thought I'd kind of take a dip into the data and analytics world. And I found it really painful. I managed teams who did data science and data engineering, and things were going wrong. Data providers were constantly giving us poor quality data, and customers were constantly demanding new insight. And so how do you reconcile that? How do you reconcile sort of crappy data with demanding customers with a team that just, wants to innovate? And so we started a company 7 years ago, and we didn't know what to call it. We called it Agile Analytic Operations, or DevOps for data science for a while, and Agilytic Ops, and then we finally settled on data ops about 4 or 5 years ago. So we have a software product that helps companies do data ops.
And is data ops then, in your opinion, Chris, an emerging market? And if so, what needs to happen to make it grow?
I think so. If you look at, the market for tools for people who do data and analytics, and those are data scientists, data engineers, they extract data, get value. That's like $100 billion. You look at the DevOps market, it's like 10. So if you smush them together, it's $1 billion market. But honestly, it is really new. And for a lot of reasons, I think one that's really pertinent is somehow when you get your bachelor's degree in computer science, there's 2 doors. You take the right door and you're in software and IT, and you take the left door and you're in data. And we don't meet. We sort of look alike and talk alike. But your data science people tend to not know very much about Agile and DevOps, and don't think in the process way. And so I think those ideas really that came from manufacturing made their way through software, and now are entering in the data and analytics field are still, to the people in data and analytics, I still think quite new. And that's the challenge, but I think it's an opportunity as well.
And I do think there is some kind of confusion still, and probably because it is still quite early for data ops as a term, about what data ops really is. So is it about integrating data into the value stream, so using those lean principles, or is it about getting data to the people that need it? So I think another way of asking that question is data ops the DevOps model for data scientists, or is it including databases in the DevOps pipeline? Matthew, do you have a view on that?
I think it's a lot more than that. So I think the integration is absolutely essential, and we have to, if we can't integrate the models we create to generate insights into our business processes, then the benefits of data ops is questionable beyond an academic exercise. So I think that's the first thing. You mentioned about people needing data, and I don't think people need data. Machines need data, and data is not information. And I think part of the whole job of sort of data analytics and machine learning is to transform data into information. So that means we can share meaningful insights that allow people to make informed decisions. And I think part of that is it's really important to visualize things properly. So perhaps we've all seen lies, and damn statistics, where people present things in perhaps an unfair way or a biased way. So it's all about transforming that data, which is really a magnitude or a measure, into meaningful information so we can make good business decisions.
Now, how's that different in the world of DevOps, do you think, Garima?
I think from a DevOps standpoint, history reminds us that this was a grounds-up journey, right? So it's a movement started by the practitioners for the practitioners. When you think about data ops, I would say it is a set of practices, and we are still yet to identify the providers and the consumers. So it's still kind of in a maturing state, and that is the beauty of how you would actually take the learnings from the DevOps movement and apply it to data ops and ensure that these set of practices which you are building up not only reflects the supply chain for data ops, where are the suppliers, where are the consumers, but also address the people challenge, the culture challenge. Who are the people of data ops? How do you build and upskill those people? And what is needed to bring the value on the table from a data ops perspective? So I think there are lessons to be learned from DevOps, but data ops have their own unique specific challenges which we need to kind of dwell into and develop.
I love your focus on the people, and there was something that really resonated that Matt said as well, which is kind of a little bit in contention with that. I think Matt said that people don't need data, machines need data, which I thought was really interesting, particularly in the context of a lot of the work that I've done this year around AI ops and this idea that we're kind of turning the machines back on themselves and making them consume the data that they've been producing from our activities. How do you feel about all of that, Chris? Data-driven conversations is a DevOps principle. Is that part of what data ops is about? People or machines? Who's leading in this space? I can't hear Chris, but he doesn't look like he's muted.
So it's always, I think it's both, honestly. It's about the process at which you get value from data. And so increasingly there's groups of people who have the role of data scientist or data analyst or data engineer, data governance. And those teams work for a chief data officer, chief analytic officer, and increasingly they're separate from the CIO, the IT team. And so companies really do believe that there is value in data. They're just struggling to do it. And most projects fail. Most models fail to get in production. And so the question is, what's the root of that failure? And for me, the root of the failure is not a lack of cool databases or not a lack of cool individual contributor tool. It's the process of a team working with those tools to get value from them. And so to me, I look at it from a managerial perspective. How do you get a team of people who are working on some technically complicated thing to do it better, to give more value to their customer? And that's the key question. And so partly that has to do with the way the team is managed and their attitude, but it also has to do with the sort of factory that they work in and how well it's managed in the factory itself.
We keep on talking about business value, business goals. Matthew, specifically, what are the goals in data ops? How do they differ from the generic goals that we have in technology and in DevOps?
So I think many organizations, we've started out, we've got transactional data which we need as a necessity just to run our business. And then suddenly we started realizing that we can do much more with it. So instead of looking at the kind of business insights or business intelligence where we would take historical data and then try and reflect on what would happen or various trends, we started looking forward more and predicting things a lot more. So I think now we're augmenting the processes we have with machine learning, with neural networks, to try and really predict insights and see what will happen, things that aren't immediately obvious. So we can take, most of machine learning is kind of linear regression, so we can draw a straight line and we can sort of predict what might happen. But we're getting insights now that we couldn't see beforehand. So I think there was some American report that said Pop-Tart sales increased before a hurricane. And you've got these kind of correlations and causations sometimes that just make no sense. So we're finding out these things, but the important thing through all of this is education. So everyone must be educated so that they can take these models, take this information from data, from raw data, and then inject that into their business process to make things better than they were. And I think part of the key thing is planning properly at the beginning, so you have success criteria that help you measure that you're heading in the right direction. And I think it's an iterative thing. And just to add the final thing, the CRISP VM model, which is a lot of people follow, is not really iterative. And it's kind of, you wait till the end, throw something over a wall, it doesn't work. And we have to be more iterative. So I think the whole process has to be do a little, don't use one model, try many models. That's how the world works. Get some feedback, which is the most valuable information you can have, re-inject that in and try again. And I think that's how little by little, that's how you introduce machine learning and data into your business.
Yeah, and one important point which I think I want to discuss here is that we did a crowd chat around the topic of innovation. And what came out of that through the community of practice is that we should be ready to throw out 50 to 70% of our innovative ideas out of the door. And when you think about that, you also need to think about how can you build those innovative ideas all along through lean practices, and how you will actually inculcate and introduce data aspects to this lean and agile aspect of innovation. So it is really important to understand that how we are actually maturing towards the next decade of technology solutions. It will be full of POCs. It will be like thousands of POCs done around the globe. And the idea behind these POCs and introducing community of practices is building continuous trust on digital solutions. And that can only be done through good data practices, which we have. And data ops will be one of the enablers for that.
So we're talking about data ops as a set of practices mainly here, but it's also a tool in some respects, isn't it, Chris? So what are the aspects of a data ops tool? What are the key functions that people should look for if they're considering buying such a thing?
Well, I reflect back on, the Agile Manifesto was in 2001, and I ran software teams following it. And it was hard, right? It was hard to go from waterfall to Agile. And what came along in 2009 was a set of technologies around DevOps to help automate those processes, specifically around sort of deployment and monitoring tools like CI and CD. And so I think DataOps has a similar set of tools to support that process. And so I think it differs kind of in a couple ways. One is that there's dev and ops in the DevOps world, but with data science and analytics, it's much more collaborative. There's more people developing and more people operating. So instead of a one-to-one problem, it's a many-to-many problem. And then also kind of harking back to what Matthew and Garima said, that the idea of iterations is really interesting in data because, you innovate through iterating, right? You find value but you iterate on two aspects in data. One is in a software application, you put it in front of your customer and iterate and learn because they interact with it. You do that in data and analytics, whether it's a charts and graphs or a list, but you're also iterating on the data itself in order to discover whether it is predictive or not. So you've got these double cycles of iteration that happen in data and analytics. You've got much more of a many-to-many problem. But you still have the same challenges that you'd have doing data and analytics. How do you run a factory? for low errors? How do you deploy quickly? How do you get people to collaborate? And so it's similar. They're cousins, but there are differences.
And I think just sorry, Helen, I was just going to add on that the iteration process is different. So when you do software development, you can debug things, you find a problem, you look at the code, you fix it. But quite often in AI, you can look at what's happening, but you don't know why. So when you go back and your neural network isn't performing, somehow you have to go back, reconfigure it, change some weights, try it again, because you can see a path. If a machine is trying to recognize a dog, you can see a path it takes, but you don't know why it took that path. So it's not the same debugging exercise. So it's very difficult. So you have to iterate even quicker to try and get this thing refined and optimized before you release it to full production.
It's interesting because I feel like there's two conversations to be had here. One is about the database in our world, and one is the data scientist and AI part of our world. And I think from my observations from the field and the consulting work that I've done, the database is often very difficult to CI/CD, if I can just totally make a sentence up. It's very hard to involve in that CI/CD pipeline. DBAs have a really hard time during incidents because the way that I perceive it is that the database is effectively stateful. So somebody makes a change, the application and the database continue running. Somewhere down the line, something goes wrong. And what people want to do is roll back or redeploy the last known good state of the application, which is all very well. But we've collected a load of data during the transactions during that time. And that becomes very hard for the DBA to unpick. Matthew, you're nodding. Do you want to build on that piece?
I can start for sure. So we have this problem a lot, and many people take different views on how to handle it. And sometimes there's just an acceptable window of loss that somehow has to be reprocessed. But I think some of the key things are the preparation is key. So your database must be entirely reproducible. Whether you have scripts that can recreate that from nothing is really, really important. So you always have a fallback position. I think the schema must live in source control. So whatever your chosen source control mechanism is, you must have really good control over that. And then obviously a comprehensive data backup strategy and handling deletions, of course, is absolutely key. So some people say we can't delete anything, and that's the way it is. Other people have many pre-processes, so version X gets updated to version Y, for example, before it moves downstream. Sometimes we have limited periods where people say we're about to make this change. If no one objects, we're going to try it then and hope it doesn't break everything. But these are really important considerations, and I don't think there's an absolute perfect way of handling them. Context is everything, but I think these are some of the things that we should consider. I don't know what anyone else would think.
I would also like to highlight there is one aspect which is technology specific, and you highlighted very well, Matthew, the challenges which we have and the ways to overcome that. The other challenge which I see, and I come from community of practice background, we initiate a lot of open source projects. Now, how difficult and how hard it is to initiate an open source project for a data ops initiative? Can we do that now? And what are the challenges or key hurdles coming in our way? We need to kind of understand that, and we need to nail down that challenge. The first and foremost challenge is democratization of data. So do we have a data backbone through which we can experiment to build our POCs? That's the first part of it. Second part is, do we have global consensus on privacy, on usage of data and the policies around it, the guidelines around it? So we need to kind of ensure that we also work towards compliance and regulatory, so that all these open source communities can contribute to this journey of data ops.
Chris, can you build on that some more?
Yeah, well, I think so. I guess there's two aspects to it. One is the sort of privacy and compliance that happens, and whether seeing models are fair or not. And I think that are really important points and not thought about enough. And when they're thought about in a sort of a very manual, ad hoc way. And I think the idea of automation that comes from DevOps and sort of data SecOps, applying data security or data privacy ops through code, I think is incredibly important. And then kind of going back to what Helen, your question, and Matthew, there's a lot of transactional systems out there, transactional databases. And if you've been in the data and analytics field for a while, you know that you're in some ways a victim of their schema changes, their data updates, their black boxes. And a lot of DevOps teams don't consider a customer their data and analytic teams. And so constantly data and analytic teams have to live with the residue of schema changes and updates and bad interfaces. And so one thing, when I speak to the DevOps community, just remember you have a data and analytic customer who's sitting on the database that your transactional systems are. Remember them, because most people who do data and analytics, they get feeds from dozens of databases. And they're trying to stitch together something that makes sense across all those entities. And so, the practice of how to deal with schema changes and data drift and drop columns is just something that you learn to live with, unfortunately. And so I think a better way is for a DevOps team to see their data and analytic cousins as customers, and to be able to say, ideally, what we'd like to see is that a DevOps process of changing a schema is linked to a DataOps process of deploying a model, deploying a new set of analytic insights that are based off that. And they should be kind of connected as opposed to disconnected, which is the way they are now.
Of course, Conway's law tells us that we design systems that match our communications models. And one of the ways that we're using that knowledge in DevOps is to create organizational designs that operate around autonomous and multifunctional teams. So not just bringing dev and ops together, but bringing test into the team, increasingly UI and UX. Is there an argument for bringing data scientists or DBAs or both into these multifunctional teams, or is that impossible with the skill sets and the amount of resources available? Matthew, what do you think?
So I think our approach, whether right or wrong, is we have kind of a central function so people can share ideas, and we have a practice that we can build on. But then I think when we do work with clients, we put data scientists or engineers or whatever roles are required into those teams, and they become part of that team, and they learn how that business works. So I think having some kind of siloed center of excellence can help, but I think it's really difficult if you're not living and working within a team on a particular target. And I think collaboration, as I mentioned, is key. No one's better than everyone. So get people together, get them all focused on the same objectives, and work out who can do best and help best. And I think the analysts are often the people. And in the agile world, I'm sure Chris will say, quite often when you need a product owner, you say, oh, where's the business analyst? They can be a product owner. It's easy. And product owners are a bit like data scientists. They're kind of unicorns. I'm not sure if they entirely exist in the perfect definition of terms. So I think we have to have these multidisciplinary teams, which again, agile sort of talks about. It doesn't mean everyone can do everything. It means that everyone learns from everyone else, and you don't have single points of failure. So my short summary of that is data scientists should live in a team that's delivering for a client so that they're close to the business objectives of whatever they're working on.
Let's think about success then. I love that, by the way. So many times I've seen business analysts being, we call it PO by proxy, an awful lot. But I think we're probably going off topic a little bit. I think the biggest problem with product ownership is that they're not given the autonomy, or the authority isn't distributed correctly from leadership. So they're often still treated as an order taker on the front end of the delivery process. But I digress. Let's talk about metrics. We've got quite a few metrics that we use in DevOps. We've got our throughput metrics, things like deployment frequency and lead time. In this particular instance, I'm going to say it's from the time the code is committed to the time it goes into production. And then we have some stability metrics around change fail rate and MTTR. Are these the same metrics we use in DataOps, or are there other metrics that we can focus on that tell us about the health of our DataOps practice? Garima, we haven't heard from you for a little while, so maybe you can start us off thinking about success metrics for DataOps.
Yeah, and for me, actually, it is an end-to-end unified process. And if you think about matrices, you have to aggregate the insights which you're building up, and also understand why these insights are important. So connect it with the purposefulness of data ops. Why data ops is essential for the business. The first thing I would say, some of these matrices would could look like responding faster to the business opportunities, making the organization more data-driven. How do we reduce risks through data? How do we ensure we are creating trust in the organization? And, when your organization becomes data-driven, naturally, you can build continuous trust in the system. And probably this can take a longer time, and you need to kind of think about it from an end-to-end perspective, that you will have somewhere around 120 zettabytes of data in the next decade. So how are you going to use your data, and how do you actually build the purposefulness around that data is extremely essential. So start thinking about that. And I'll give you an example of, when people interact with us in the community of practice, they actually tell us, here we have this data. Can we build an artificial intelligence tool around it? And this is how, we kind of, have to differentiate the mindset that it's not about the data, it's about the business question and the problem itself. So think about your business question, think about your problem, and then build the matrices around your data.
I think that's a really good point. Don't start with data. And I think just to give people the context of a zettabyte, 1 zettabyte is about 36 million hours of high definition video. So we're talking about a lot of bits and bytes.
We're going to run out for him.
Yeah. So
that's a lot of reruns and a lot of Netflix series, isn't it?
Yeah, I've been surprisingly sort of disappointed in the amount of measurement that data and analytic teams do about their process. You would think that if their goal in life is to help people be data-driven, they should be pretty data-driven about their own work. And it's surprising that, like if you look at deployment frequency, and we've done surveys and asked people, it's unknown. It ranges anywhere from, weeks to months, honestly, to deploy changes. And then if you want to look at the big question of, are what you're producing in data and analytics correct? What's your error rate? And most organizations don't. They'll put in a few line counts, but they're kind of hoping that the data that passes through the factory that produces insights works. They don't measure data drift. They don't measure models. They don't do statistical process control. And so, unfortunately, the amount of measurements that people have are actually quite poor. And it's ironic given that you want to be data-driven. But I think it's essential because of the cultural change that you want to do to adopt data ops, because most people who've been in the data and analytics field a long time have a very visceral reaction to saying, yes, you can change what you have in production fast, and you can do it at the same time with very, very low errors that make you look bad when you walk into the cafeteria. And a lot of people are scared and worried that you've built these analytic systems with baling wire and you just got it to work. And don't tell me to change it. Don't change the data feed. If I touch it, I break it. And so we've got a degree of fragility and a fear that happens in data and analytics teams. And so it is a cultural change, because like with DevOps or any agile field, the fact that you could iterate quickly and not break things, the fact that you could get a bunch of people to collaborate together, those things are all seen as opposite. And I think the best functioning data ops teams know that you can kind of push the graphic equalizer up on all those, and you can do all those quickly. And the way to make the cultural change is to measure those attributes, measure speed to deploy, measure error rates, measure the amount of collaboration that's happened, and use that.
And I think there's a real caution about what metrics you choose. So we worked on some data, and it was essentially, it meant 2% of the data was positive and 98% was negative. And someone had worked before for 3 months and found a model that was 97% accurate. And I said, just call everything false. And already that's 98% accurate by definition. So we have to be careful of the metrics we choose. And I think there's room for qualitative measurements. And I think, Chris, you mentioned levels of collaboration, so we can try and put a number onto it. But there are lots of qualitative measures. Do people feel that it's helping them? Are people confident that they understand what's happening? Are they concerned that maybe this is just the tip of the iceberg where their job gets replaced or displaced somehow? So I think these qualitative measures are just as important when you're trying to build a good business function.
I want to know how we can collect data that tells us how data-driven we are.
That's right. Yeah, that's what we need, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, Helen, you can actually introduce gamification.
Oh, well, you lead us on to my favourite question of yours. How can we make DataOps more fun? Garima.
Yes, I am a big advocate for gamification, and before actually I start talking about gamification, I would like to people to understand when we talk about gamification, this journey started from very elementary and small steps where we introduced leadership boards or badges or ideas around gamification of activities which we're doing, and now how we see it converging into data practices is that if, let's say, you have your gamification and machine learning models, if you can converge those two and answer the biggest business question you have, can we do that? And if we could do that, then it would become more interesting as well as valuable. Now, coming back to the question, how we can make it fun and, how we can gamify and experiment with data. So there are a lot of games which we have tried and tested in our community of practice. There's one which we do is shortest lead time game, which is basically a very data-driven approach to measure efficiency and get people started thinking on, practical business problems around, how you can get more efficient. There are other games which we have developed, like smallest number of errors. And if you have you're actually having a data-driven approach in your CI/CD pipeline and you integrate that, and you can have numerous pipelines in a large enterprise. So you start scoring your pipelines and start learning from each other. That's how you can actually build some gamification around what data you have, and also start converging that data into a more essential answers to your business questions.
There's always a risk with those sort of compare team or pipeline to pipeline to team. The leadership start playing teams off each other. How do we avoid that sort of negative behavior that can degrade trust in an organization?
I think this is an excellent question, and this is a mindset shift which needs to happen if you want to lead towards a decade of innovation. So that mindset shift of building technology collectively has to happen, and that can only happen when you have trusted people in the team, and you need to ensure that you have the same level of awareness, same level of education, skill, and you're learning from each other. So it's a cultural mindset shift which needs to happen, and of course you can actually put some governance models around, how do you do that? How do you measure, how much learning you're bringing into the organization? So these are some steps in the journey, and I think that will be able to kind of not completely get rid of, but at least dilute that negativity around, gamification aspects.
We could try and gamify leadership. Are there any architectural models that make DataOps easier, do we think? Does cloud native make it easier and more fun to do this stuff? Chris, you're nodding. Tell us how.
So if you look at, there are Oracle database salesmen who tend to be very muscular and very aggressive, who up to 10 years ago would sell you database cores. And if you wanted to try something new, you'd have to talk to your Oracle salesman. And they were, I don't know, I never liked talking to them, mainly because, I don't know, perhaps they intimidated me. And what's really nice about the cloud is you don't have to talk to salespeople. And so you can turn on another version of the database. You can scale up the amount of storage that you use, and you don't need permission to do it. And it's actually incredibly cheap to do it. And so what that means is it lowers the cost to try different things out. And so for many years, the weight of data was so expensive. You'd have a lot of analytic systems that were server resident, that were treated as pets, not cattle, and that were managed in a very careful way by sort of the one or two people who know how it works. And what the cloud offers, the idea of virtualizing the infrastructure, the idea of the cheap sort of compressed columnar databases like Redshift or Snowflake, sort of big Hadoop clusters, is the virtualization of data and the virtualization of compute. And both those things actually make it much easier to try different versions of things, which make it much easier to play with data and learn different ways. And I think that makes a big deal. And you don't have to go back to like server resident analytic systems and talking to the Oracle database salesman if you want to try something out.
I think, Chris, so we worked with a client and they did this and it worked very well for them. And when they did some on-premise stuff, and when they shoved everything into the cloud, they just left it running, and actually it cost them a lot in terms of compute power. And at the end of the month, they looked and there was quite a big number attached to the power they'd used. So I would say it does scale, it does level the playing field. You just have to be a little careful. Sometimes things can run. And what we did was we took big data, for want of a better word, and worked harder on feature extraction and reduced that compute power by a factor. And that made it much cheaper and much easier for them to handle. So just because the cloud is elastic, infinitely elastic, we can perhaps assume sometimes we just have to watch and be careful of how much resource we're actually using. But there are great measurements and dashboards to show you that.
This is super exciting that engineers have the autonomy in this cloud-driven world to choose what technologies to use and how to use them. I think, Chris, you mentioned the Chief Data Officer earlier on in one of your talks. What is the Chief Data Officer's role, and how much do they define what the technical strategy looks like from a tools and architectural perspective?
Well, he or she's role is to help organizations play offense and defense with data. The defense is, is there a risk that the data gets out of the building? Are we making predictions that are sexist or racist? I think that those are important aspects. But the offense part is, are we actually getting value out of the data that we have in the building? And to that extent, I think they increasingly have a lot of autonomy, both in terms of infrastructure spend, staffing, and there are data and analytic teams not of like 2 or 3 people, but of hundreds of people in an organization who are trying to get value out of data. And one of the things that is increasingly interesting in the data and analytics world that differs in the IT world is just the amount of what's called self-service, the amount of people using tools on their desktop to get insight from data. And it could be to visualize data, it could be to prep or transform data, or even to do data science. And it's as if half your developers in the organization were using low-code tools and half were doing sort of high-code tools. And everyone does data and analytics, and they're all trying to coordinate and work together. And so the CDO has to handle that information where he or she may not control their own destiny, that they're having to collaborate across lines of business, across thousands and thousands of people in the organization. And that makes it especially tough.
Some of the stuff you're saying, some of the things that Garima was saying really were getting me thinking about the relationship between the Chief Data Officer and the Chief Information Security Officer. So I think with data, there's kind of 2 things, if I want to oversimplify life massively. It's like gaining value from it whilst protecting it as well. It's such an important asset, and our customers suffer so badly if we don't protect it very well. So Garima was talking about one of the metrics or goals we look at in terms of reducing risk, for example. So how should a Chief Data Officer, a CDO and a CISO play together? Garima, how do those 2 roles work together?
I think when you look at from a data perspective, there are 3 typical challenges which we have. The first challenge what we have is how we supply, prepare and consume our data, which becomes more agile. So that means you have to put not only technology aspect, but also process and people aspect. That's the first challenge. The second challenge is how you democratize that data and keeping in view privacy, regulations, and compliance.
What do you mean when you say democratize data? You used that phrase earlier. What does it mean for the audience?
It means that when data becomes accessible to everyone as a self-service, and it becomes a choice for people to ensure that whether they want to pass on their data, they want their data to be used in a certain way or not. So that means you are making that data as a choice as democratic as possible. So you in a democracy, you will have to have guidelines, you have to have regulations, but you also have to be aware that you're responsible for your own data. So that means you have to have self-awareness, self-governance, as well as education around data policies and compliance and regulatory bodies. So that's the second aspect which I'm talking about. And the third aspect is how you create value out of the data you have in the system. And value, when I talk about value, I talk about a larger value. How do you actually use the data to uplift the life index of people? There are three things, and these three things have to work together. So if you talk about information security officer or CISOs in the organization, they're primarily focused on the second part of policy, regulation, and governance. The first part, which we talked about, making the data agile and usable for your business questions and business problems. I would understand the primary role of a chief data officer would be centered around that. And if you think about the CXO level people, they would be focused on how you are using that data and making it purposeful for the business, so it is used for good. So when I make these connections, these are the 3 points I look at.
Cool. I also want to make another connection then. We've talked about the connection between CDO, CISO. What about, we touched on this earlier, what about the connection between data ops, AI ops, and ML ops? And I think there's some confusion in the market around ML ops, whether it's machine learning ops or whether it's model ops. So Chris, do you want to start us off on that one?
Well, first of all, I'm just super happy that people are talking about it, because 4 or 5 years ago, we'd go to trade shows and talk about data ops, and we wore chef hats and gave out wooden spoons, and people thought we were like aliens from another planet. And so by and large, the data and analytics field isn't ops-centric. And so now there's a set of terms that have become, and sometimes it's called model ops, sometimes it's called ML ops, it's data ops, data gov ops, analytic ops. There's a whole bunch of terms out there. And the fact that people are thinking that these sort of management techniques around lean and agile and total quality management really apply to data and analytics is fantastic. And so I think there is a general confusion, because there's now biz ops and and the marketers have gotten a hold of it and put the suffix of ops on everything. I guess I just go back to the core principle of, like, call it what you want, but like, if you've got a bunch of people working on a shared technically complicated thing, it's an assembly line, it's building software, it's building a data and analytics, there's a shared set of principles that have been discovered over the past 50, 70 years on how to make it work that go, they go back to lean, they go back to TQM, they go back to Deming. And I think it's how you take those principles and apply it. And in fact, our business is just taking those, my company's business is taking those principles that exist already and applying them to this domain. And so however you call it, I'm just happy that people are talking about it.
Matthew, how do you make a distinction between those things? And are they all for ops, or are they for dev too?
Well, I think that so many people think that model ops is the kind of the parent, the sort of base class, if you like. So everything falls under it. So you have the concept of the right governance. You have a consistent system right across the organization. AOps is then the next level down, if you like, and that leads then to data ops. But I think, as Chris said, we tend to get something sometimes and latch onto it. So everything is a service. I've seen data ops as a service. So I think the semantics is less important. I think you need this layered kind of understanding of how you manage your data. So you have people within the teams that are extracting and processing data. You have the people that are consuming the data, and of course the education that must go with that. So that's there's a gap there, just waiting for someone to fall through if you don't manage that well. And then you have the whole governance piece. And I think that Garima, you mentioned the importance of data privacy, and now we're getting to the point where you can have information and it's obfuscated and you can't tell anything personal from it, but you share it with some more obfuscated information, and then suddenly you get insights that you shouldn't get. And I think these boundaries cross organizations, so no one's actually jumping on them and saying we need to stop this. So I think Netflix's competition when they shared data which was completely unpersonalized, someone took IMDb information, cross-referenced the two, and gleaned some insights from it. So the care that we have to take, I think we get to organization level, we get to the kind of model ops, but is there something above that that guides all of these organizations? Because data floating out there is just getting crazy, zettabytes as we've talked about.
That's
so there's something that sits above the organization almost, sorry.
So it's an interesting hierarchy I think you described. So the way you see it is ML ops, then AI ops, then data ops, and then something above ML ops, but we're not sure. DevOps maybe?
Yeah. There's a lot of talk of ethics, and I think it's a good thing to discuss. But a lot of it is talk, and it's kind of how do we unify it, and how do we get, because it's a bit, I explained it, it's a bit like, sorry, it's a football analogy, but people say we should constrain the amount that teams can spend in Europe. But unless everyone does it, it will never work, because other people will just leverage from it. And this is the challenge. It's like global warming. It's a political problem as much as a technical one. So how do we manage this differential privacy and the data that's floating around, which is safe on its own, but when it gets collected with something else, it becomes an exposure point? I don't know the answer, quite honestly.
I don't think anyone knows the answer. I think it's a conversation that keeps on popping up in all of these Bright Talk things at the moment, actually. And there's the ethics of how data is used, and then there's the ethics of AI in particular, which is the one that I keep coming back to, having watched The Social Dilemma fairly recently and been really struck by how humans have got so good at using AI to extract the value from the humans that they want, but are actually damaging the humans in the process of achieving their goals. I think, Garima, you're particularly interested in ethics as well, am I right?
I would put my point of view on this table. Ethics is a question which is broader in perspective, because what is ethical in an Eastern community is not considered to be ethical in a Western community. So it's a broader discussion and a dialogue which we have to take when it comes to AI. And we have been, Helen, in different conversations together. I think in the next 5 years, how we would see AI shaping up is based on the data we retrieve from the machines. So that will help us understand more and more the challenge which we will face from these AI applications. And this will build upon in a more human-centric manner in the next part of the decade. So I think we are not ready for actually claiming that we will be able to replace some of these human aspects with AI solutions.
And I think, Garima, the concept, without that framework, it goes to the law. And if something's legal, it doesn't mean it's ethical. And I think this is where some of the challenges occur. And Chris mentioned fairness earlier on. There's always a trade-off between accuracy and fairness. And sometimes the most accurate model is intrinsically biased by definition. So when you remove that bias or prejudice, you make it less accurate. So there's no absolute right answer. You have to find your position between fairness and accuracy, be comfortable with it, and convince yourself that you're doing the right thing for everyone. And it's a hard choice to make with no absolute right answer.
Yeah.
Right. And I would like to just extend this thought a little bit more before, Chris, you jump in. When you actually think about the use cases, and if you are using machine learning models in an industry specific segment where precision is important, obviously you will look at accuracy and timing. But when you look at more solutions towards more uncertain problem statements, where accuracy is not that high, you can actually debate yourself that maybe it's just a general guideline for you to kind of start thinking about the problem, and it's not a solution as such. So it's the applicability as well, which you need to consider when you are thinking about accuracy and timing.
Yeah, and if you look at it from the discussions I have and go to conferences with chief data officers, they're thinking about it two ways. One is the sort of de jure rules that are by, it's the California privacy, it's GDPR, it's this country's privacy rules that they have to do, or else they're going to get in trouble. And then there's the sort of de facto rules about what is right to do with the data, and is it right to make this prediction? Is it right to integrate the data in this way? And actually, I'm really pleasantly surprised that sort of set of de facto questions about is it right to do this is actually being asked and talked about. And it's really come up over in the last sort of 3 or 4 years. And having been in the field for a while, it wasn't asked 5 or 10 years ago. Just like, hey, I got the data, I'm going to do what I want with it. And so I think those are great questions to ask, but it's also complicated just because the rules are getting more complicated. And even just to enforce the difference between GDPR and California privacy and the rules across nations or even states, it's hard for chief data officers and teams to keep track of all that and also just try to be good moral people.
You're responsible, Chris, for the DataOps Manifesto. Does that have any call-outs to this sort of conversation, or can you summarize the key points of it for us?
It does a little. I think mainly the idea was that teams who do data science and engineering and analytics need to work in a more iterative way, and they need to take inspiration from DevOps and manufacturing. So the wording of it is intentionally kind of stolen from the Agile Manifesto, and then someone did a DevOps Manifesto. We sort of munged those together and took out the word software and put in the word data and analytics, and then we got the manifesto. And it was sort of a statement of purpose because the word data ops wasn't used, and we wrote the first data ops Wikipedia article just to say, here's what we think this is. And I've been pleasantly surprised that we've had like 15,000 people sign it. And I think it does state an intention of, it's a better way to work. And the way I emotionally tie to it is I just running data and analytic teams for many years. It was not a fun job. And it's, there's no glory. You're kind of the janitors of the world, picking up data from different systems, putting it together. And I think that suffering sort of drove me to say, well, it's got to be a better way, and made me think about the transformation that happened in software with DevOps, and how back in 1999, there were release engineers who were quote unquote doing DevOps, but they were paid less than on the dev team I managed. And you fast forward that now 20 years in the future, and DevOps professionals are highly paid, in fact, paid more than some software professionals. And I think the idea of data ops as a career and the idea of focusing on operations as a delivery of value is really at its beginning in data and analytics. And, that's partly one of the reasons why we wrote the manifesto is operations matter. And if you focus on those, you can actually make your life better.
I think, Chris, many people question whether the Agile Manifesto now needs a kind of update and is it still relevant. But I think the point about individuals and interactions over processes and tools is just as relevant today as perhaps it ever was in that ski lodge many, many years ago. And I think the whole concept of data scientists today, I see many people who step into it partly because they enjoy it, partly because maybe they think it's more rewarding financially, but they focus on technology first. And I think, creating some mathematical geniuses that can put fantastic models together, we'll always need that. But, the problem is turning away from real business processes, and a data scientist should understand the business domain. Because if they don't understand that domain, how can they possibly help to derive business value? And I think we need to focus a little more on, get away from the kind of partial differentiation, loss functions, and all the fun stuff, if you like, mathematics, and focus more on delivering business value. And I think that's key in all of this.
Yeah, and it's hard though, because it's much more fun to stay in your room for a couple months and play with data and algorithms and write some code than it is to actually talk to people. Because people will, when you present something in front of the people, they will give you good feedback and sometimes don't like it. And so the emotional part of focusing on value and iteration is not to be downtrodden, because it is harder, honestly. And I think pulling people through that, because it's easy. Like, I love a good algorithm, and I love to spend, up to a few years ago, I still coded, and my personality when I code is much different than when I don't. And so I think it's important to understand how hard it is for people to focus on value. And that's where good management comes in, to try and pull people into saying, look, you don't want to spend 2 months doing nothing, right? At least in the next 2 weeks, get some feedback, see if this is you're in the ballpark of being right.
I think the concept of knowing when to stop being as important as knowing when to start, because sometimes you can get into a rabbit hole and just keep going. And then you convince yourself that if you stop now, someone's going to sort of go crazy. So you keep going even farther. So I think set realistic goals, set success criteria, and sometimes realize that the next 5 days of effort might give you much better return over here than it will do continuing on the path you're on.
Yep. A 1% increase in prediction value probably isn't worth 5 days.
Yeah, and I would like to add that how powerful it would be to have data stories which you can build for decision making. So create value feedback loops for business stakeholders to ensure that whatever you're doing at the other end is making a purposeful change towards the business.
Yeah, so that's hard to do, right? To know what the purpose is and know what the change is, especially, sometimes data and analytic organizations do the opposite. They sort of vomit lots of charts and graphs up and let the business user find it themselves, and they play defense. They're like, okay, I've got all my data, it's all there, you go figure it out. And so I think that's a great, Garima, what you said is so true, trying to focus on getting business objectives and have that be your goal, as opposed to these defensive maneuvers of I just build an edifice and walk away.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing. It brings me memories from the past when we used to handle security as we are handling data today, where there was one security breach and we actually layered up our security without actually deconstructing or reconstructing the security policies, guidelines, as well as technology solutions. With DevSecOps, what we have done is that we have actually brought a very different dimension towards how we deal with security solutions. How do we make security part of the business as such, shift left, security as code. So it's the same kind of mindset shift which needs to happen when we are dealing with data. So it's a cultural mindset shift, and it will take time, and it's the hardest step in this journey, I would say. And this reminds me of historically what had happened with DevOps and DevSecOps, and now we are discussing DataOps.
Yeah, with 3 minutes left, let's reflect on the history, but think about the future. So just 1 minute from each of you, starting with Garima, then to Matthew, and then Chris can have the last word today. Get your crystal balls out. What's going to happen for DataOps in 2021, Garima?
I would say we have just started this journey of DataOps. So I would like to have starting point as community of practices build up around DataOps to actually establish a set of practices and to understand and ensure that how we can build innovative solutions around data and leveraging that data. So I think in 2021, we will see more and more communities joining in this DataOps movement, and they will learn from DevOps. That's how I would see.
Matthew, your predictions for DataOps in 2021?
So I think really the path is good. We need to continue. I think we need to focus on a few things. So build teams, not superstars, I think is really important. The unit of delivery is a team, not an individual. I think we need to set realistic outcomes and agree the right success criteria and build these into our data strategy. I think we need to make things reproducible. Google have just written a paper about under-specification and the idea that different weights mean you get different outcomes all the time, so we must always be mindful of that. And I think we need to incorporate ethics, transparency and explainability into everything we're doing, even into the models themselves, or consider how that would work. I'll mention again accuracy against fairness. It's really, really important. So I think we're lifting up the whole thing and we're thinking at a slightly higher level now that we've got some of the technology in place. And I think the last thing I would say is build trust, because if you have trust, nothing else matters. And if you don't have trust, nothing else matters. So I think that's where we should be heading.
And the final word, Chris.
Those both were really good, so I'm not sure how I can add it. I think one of the things is I think data and analytic teams are realizing that the operational side really matters, and that there's a role there for people who do DevOps, call it a data ops engineer, that I think they can really bring the same ideas and principles that they use with software and IT into this sort of bigger and more further behind data and analytics world. So I think it's increasingly the role of a data ops engineer helping to make that change, and it's coming because of all the things that Matthew and Garima said, and also the senior leadership is more and more realizing that just don't buy another database, just don't buy another tool. I got to look at how my team works. I got to look at how operations work. That's the big lever I need to push.
Fabulous. So thank you, audience, for attending this episode of Day-to-Day DevOps. And thank you to Chris, Garima and Matthew for joining us to share their perspectives and insights. If you click through the attachments button in your player, you'll be able to register for episode 10 of our series, where we'll be looking at ChatOps use cases for the new normal. Lastly, we would really appreciate your feedback on today's episode and suggestions for what you would like to hear about in future episodes of the series. Thank you for listening, and thank you, team, for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.